Welcome to the FinCEN Report podcast. I am Jonathan Wilson, the CEO of the FinCEN Report company. As you know, we are a provider of online filing services for reporting companies that need to file reports under the Corporate Transparency Act. And we use this podcast to interact with professionals and thought leaders in the space surrounding the Corporate Transparency Act, corporate law, anti-money laundering compliance, and topics like that. And today we're going to be joined by Ina Ganz. Ina is a CPA. She's practiced with a number of accounting firms in the United States, and she currently practices in Switzerland with USTAXFS, which is a consulting firm that is aimed primarily at individuals and entities outside the U.S. who are making investments into the U.S. and therefore have unique U.S. tax reporting obligations. And in our conversation, we're going to talk about some of the unique perspectives that European investors have when investing into the United States as they relate to the Corporate Transparency Act and all of the disclosure obligations that come along with that. So stay tuned for our conversation coming up right now with Ina Ganz. So Ina Ganz, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Absolutely. So Ina, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? What's your practice like today, and what is the perspective that you bring to the topic?
Sure. I am part of USTAXFS team here in Switzerland. In Switzerland, we have essentially two offices in Zurich and Geneva. Overall, our company has been in business for 35 years with an additional office in London as well. We're essentially divided into three divisions. One is trust, individual, and corporate. When it comes to me specifically, I'm the head of the corporate practice in Switzerland that rolls into a broader corporate team that is sitting in London and Berlin, actually.
Your focus is on Swiss corporations or Swiss investors who invest in corporations? What's the corporate?
So I have a number of clients. I would say a big chunk of my practice is really private equity and VC funds that are located outside of the United States. They are subject to U.S. tax rules due to the fact that they either invest in the U.S. or they have U.S.-based investors, or both for that matter. So because of that, they're subject to U.S. compliance obligations and rules and requirements, and that is the big chunk of my practice. Then I obviously have some individual clients. I don't do individual work personally, but to the extent that individual clients own any type of entities, obviously I do entity level type of work. I also work closely with trusts and similar issues. So for me, anything that touches an entity, whether it's a US-based entity owned by a foreign individual or a foreign entity owned by a US individual, or just a fund type of structure, that's what I do.
Right. Okay. So entities outside the U.S. investing into corporations and LLCs in the United States. Is your personal profile, are you an accountant or a lawyer or both? Or
So I'm a U.S. trained CPA licensed in the state of California. Most of my career has been actually spent in the United States with PricewaterhouseCoopers. I started my practice in New York, and then I kind of changed divisions and did a little bit of everything. I did a number of years in Chicago office of PwC, and then in San Jose, and then back in New York. I joined this particular team in Switzerland only about a year ago.
What is the reaction to investors outside the United States to the Corporate Transparency Act and the prospect that they may have to disclose some of their personal information to the U.S. Treasury Department?
So it's slowly starting to introduce them to the idea. You have to understand that there's this unique sort of flavor when it comes to foreign investors. Before the Corporate Transparency Act, what we have seen, even with sort of partnership and fund reporting, imagine you have, a fund that is formed as a partnership for U.S. tax purposes, and it has foreign investors. To the extent that this fund is earning U.S. source income, we need to issue Schedules K-1 to everyone, including foreign investors, and that means their information may or will be disclosed to the IRS. So even in that context, we're used to foreign investors being very how should I say, not particularly comfortable with that idea. So anything that touches the IRS or any info provided to them is already sort of kind of touching a nerve here. So when we kind of go around right now and let them know that, oh, by the way, there is this new law and it's going to come into effect Jan 1 of 2024, and to the extent that you're going to be deemed to be a beneficial owner of a particular entity that is really in the scope of this law, your information will have to be disclosed. There is a lot of unease, so we have to sort of educate them. The questions range from, where would this information go? What happens if I don't disclose it? Or what happens if information changes? How do I do it? What constitutes beneficial ownership? What constitutes substantial control? All these definitions: who's in scope, who's out of scope, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, there is a lot, but there is a lot of nervousness around it.
A lot of nervous. I can imagine. How do you think many investors outside the U.S. interacting with the Corporate Transparency Act are going to respond? Are they going to try to find alternative ways of structuring your investments into the U.S. in order to limit the scope, limit the number of people whose data needs to be disclosed? Are they going to cut back on their investing in the U.S., or are they just going to take a deep breath and find a way to get themselves comfortable?
It's hard to know, but to be honest with you, in my experience overall, not just here in Europe, just as a tax practitioner, there are very few companies or individuals that do something specific that is tax-driven only, meaning to the extent that there is a reason, say, for a company to be structured a particular way from operational perspective, then so be it. And then if we can optimize it from tax perspective, then, great. Where I'm going with this is the fact that, in my experience, tax or compliance applications never really drive these decisions. I mean, it may seem so to the outside world, but not in my view. So to answer your question directly, I do not really think that people are going to be restructuring just for this reason. I don't think people will be getting out of their structures or their investments just for this reason. I think, I think we as tax practitioners will have to educate them, sort of ease their nervousness, explain the rules, explain that it's not, maybe it's cumbersome, but it's not scary. And I think essentially they'll comply, right? They'll comply. I'm sure there'll be lots of tools on the market that will help them do so. There'll be lots of advisors who will be advising appropriately. And I think that's how it will remain. That's my personal view on the subject.
Sure. I'm only a U.S. lawyer, have not practiced.
What is your view, by the way? May I ask you?
I'll tell you that. Thank you. Yeah. But my expectation is that European investors are already familiar with their public registry obligations. So a European fund that's invested, for example, in a French corporation knows that shareholder information is going to be publicly available in France. What the CTA requires is much less than that. The CTA information is available to the Treasury departments. It's available to law enforcement with some restrictions, but it's not publicly available. You and I can't go to a website and simply look it up. So if the European investor is comfortable investing in France with that level of disclosure, they ought to be able to get comfortable with the reduced level of disclosure there is in the US.
And I agree with that. And that's my point. I think that's one of our kind of main roles is to explain that, yeah, it sounds scary, but like the impact of it or where the information goes, to your point, is not scary at all, frankly speaking. It's just a lot of work and actually a lot of technical work to figure out who is a person that is, required to report.
That is the hard part. Just this morning, I had a colleague at another law firm send me a hypothetical where they were going to set up a Delaware corporation as a wholly owned subsidiary of a UK corporation. And the client was asking, are we going to have to disclose the identities of our UK shareholders under this new American Corporate Transparency Act? And the answer was, yeah, you will.
You would, yeah.
We wondered whether there might be a way for the UK entity perhaps to drop down two subsidiaries. One would be in the nature of a tax blocker, give the tax blocker management control over the US subsidiary so that 25% or greater shareholders might get disclosed, but we could effectively wall off all of the individual shareholders because none of them could arguably have substantial control.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of that might be worth exploring for sensitive situations where it's worthwhile to do so.
I like this idea, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, that might be worth. And I was curious if you had ever come across that in your practice.
Not yet. To be honest with you, we haven't started having these sort of structuring conversations with our clients. We have just started introducing them to the fact that the law even exists and, answering sort of very basic questions as who has to report in absence of any planning. We have not started exploring sort of fixes or ways to better a particular situation.
Sure. And I'm curious, I get this question often from U.S. lawyers. How do we go about telling our clients of the new law? I'm aware of some law firms that are very aggressively preparing letters and sending them out to every corporation and LLC they've ever formed. Others are being more passive and simply putting a memo on the website and waiting for clients to call with questions. Where do you see your practice fitting in as far as communicating to clients?
So a lot of our clients, kind of come to us from really fund managers and trust companies, et cetera, right? So, they act as aggregation of our clients. So obviously, when we have conversations with, say, a hypothetical fund manager, we'll let them know that it exists. So they should sort of, let their clients or funds know that it's out there and it may impact what it is that they need to report. We did share with them sort of a one-pager maybe 6 months ago that they can pass on to their clients as well, right? So because in that sense, they're almost acting as an intermediary for us and cover kind of a lot of ground. We're producing a larger paper specific to trust clients because I think there are some nuances when it comes to trust sort of division and what they need to consider in light of the law. We're doing this podcast with you. And yeah, we're taking it from there at the moment.
Sure. But I agree. There's definitely a lack of awareness among business people, at least in the United States, from what I can see. And I think everyone in our space needs to do a lot of work to get the word out because there's only 6 or 7 months left before all of this takes effect. So it's going to be a busy 2023.
Agreed. We also package it a little bit, because LLCs are impacted. And we have a lot of clients that have a lot of US LLCs in the structures. So the way at times when we introduce this new law is packaged together with just the reporting that exists for wholly owned, US LLCs owned by foreigners, right? Because a lot of clients get surprised that there is 5472 reporting for those because everybody's kind of used to the fact that, LLC is sort of a disregarded entity. So people don't pay attention. So we kind of drop those two things together by saying, look, you have hundreds of LLCs in your structure. By the way, there are two things you need to consider. One, the 5472 reporting that has existed actually for a while, plus this new law. Because what we're seeing, even in the US, we've had clients that came to us and said, we've been advised by law firms, we don't need to do anything because it's just a disregarded entity. So we need to sort of, to re-educate them and say, it's a disregarded entity, but for these specific provisions. And, Corporate Transparency Act is going to be one of them.
Absolutely. Yikes. I hope no one out there is confusing the concept of disregarded entity an exempt entity. Yeah. Well, I'll be curious to see how quickly the market, especially involving LLCs and LLC operating agreements, begins to incorporate language to encounter CTA compliance. And that's a concept that I've been using in my operating agreements, a whole separate paragraph that obligates the members of the LLC to provide their data, contemplates the idea of a compliance officer whose role it will be to collect the data and complete the reports, and then obligates the members to indemnify the LLC if their information provided is not accurate and timely, and so on.
Of course.
But I'm not sure how widely that's settling into the market yet. But great. Well, thank you so much for your perspective on European entities investing in the U.S. Any final thoughts to share with our audience?
Just pay attention. I think it's still a developing thing, right? I think pay attention to the products that are out there. Pay attention to podcasts similar to this one. I think there'll be plenty written on various blogs about it, and sort of just know that it's out there. And there are penalties associated with not reporting, by the way, civil and criminal. Something to keep in mind. I believe the civil one is up to $500 per day of non-compliance. So kind of a hefty thing. So please don't ignore this. That's my final thought. Yeah.
Don't ignore it. That's good advice for all of us. Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to talking with you perhaps on a future podcast.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Bye.